Stage, the wonderful Ian Dowding.
Hello, good evening everyone, and thank you for coming and listening to something that's a little bit more on the serious side actually. After all that hilarity, it seems a shame, but anyway, I hope you enjoy this. At some time, nearly a lot of people, myself included, looked into our own. I noticed there was a talk about genealogy. A lot of people looked into their family history, which is and I did it too quite a little while ago. And I looked at my father's side of the family, and you get to do a little bit and find out a bit, and especially after watching Have I Got News for You? After you've watched Who Do You Think You Are and things like that. And it's always quite interesting. You find out a few interesting things, and I sort of did that for a while, and then put the file away and forgot about it. And then, quite a few years later, my son, who actually lives in Holland, so I don't see him very often, but we sometimes swap anecdotes on WhatsApp and sometimes a video call, and he announced that he was also going to look into our family history, which I thought was quite interesting. He sort of picked up the baton from me. And then he texted me, and he said that he'd sent his DNA. And I thought, gosh, that's really serious about it, and had this rather sneaky feeling that he was actually quite interested in finding something a bit exotic about his makeup, which when it came back, it turned out that his DNA was 55%, or something like 55%, Northern European, with a bit of Scandinavian and a bit of I can't remember the other one, a bit of Celtic thrown in as well, and which is about the same sort of mongrel makeup that most of us are in this country, I believe. So anyway, I didn't it wasn't anything new in that respect, and then. He was telling me this by text message, all the things he was doing with this, and he said that he was looking into my mother's side of the family, which I hadn't done before. I looked mainly at my father's side of the family, and he said he sent me these sort of dribs and drabs messages about my mother's family, and at one point he sent me a message that said, your mother had 4 brothers, and I said to him, Mother only ever mentioned. I tell you now at this point that my mother wasn't alive at this moment. And I said, she only ever had 2 older brothers. That's all she told me about. Anyway, you sure you're on the right branch of the family tree? And they said, no, it's definitely. DNA doesn't lie. And so I said, well, who are these other brothers? And he said, well, she had a younger brother called Terence, who was born in 1927, but he died when he was 3 years old. And I thought, well, perhaps that's what my mother didn't want to talk about it, because it was obviously rather painful if you have a 3-year-old in your family die. So I thought, well, that explains that. So I said, who was the other brother? So he said, well, his name was Ronald, and he was an actor and a carpenter, and he was born in 1929, and he died in 2014. And I said, are you absolutely sure? He said, yes, of course I'm sure. He said, I can send you a photograph. And he sent me a photograph on my mobile phone. And as soon as I saw it, now anyone who's of my age, of a similar age to me, that generation, you would also have recognised this person. And I just laughed out loud. I was just absolutely astounded, because this person was famous, or what I should say is this person was infamous. Now, my mother kept this secret all her life. She took it to the grave with her and never mentioned this person at all. And of course, all I could think of for the next few days is all the times that she must have had to lie to keep this quiet and avoid questions that came from the family. But and so to rather more than put this into context, while I was thinking about it, I realised that, of course, looking at my parents' lives, I mean, they they lived through their growing up years was through the first half of the last century. And if you think about it, there were 2 world wars in that first half of the century. And those world wars were quite close together, really. It was only 21 years difference between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War. And the way I was looking at it was that, families were fractured. They were a lot of young people, a lot of people died in those wars, and it fractured families and left people with memories that they just didn't want to talk about. And I thought, maybe my mother never talked about her family. This was part of it. But what also came to my mind was that my parents had both been through the Second World War and had both avoided near-death experiences completely separately, which I thought was all part of this. And I'll tell you briefly the stories of this, because I think it puts everything into context. And I'll explain more about this secret uncle when we get when you understand what I'm talking about my parents. Now, my father was born in 1905. Actually, I think it's, I'm using this. Hold on a minute, see if I can do this. Get the right one at the right time. My father was born in 1905. That is a line up there. As my father is the second from the right. And that was him with his family. His father is next to him. And he was born in 1905, which was too late to be called up. Too early, rather. He was too young to be called up for the First World War, so he avoided that one. But when it came to the Second World War, he was too old then to be actually called up, but he joined anyway because he wanted to take part in the fight of fascism. And that was him, and he joined the army. It's the upward brushed moustache, which I think is always rather sort of typical of people of that, of the fashion in those days. And what he did was, in 1942, he was on a ship crossing the Indian Ocean to go and fight the Japanese who were fighting in Burma, trying to take over Burma. And halfway across the Indian Ocean, they were radioed to tell them that that Burma had already fallen to the Japanese. So there was no point in going, and his ship was redirected to India, and he spent the war in India without seeing any action. In fact, his story was that he was a very good card player. My father, he could count cards, and being an officer, he was very sought after at the upper classes of Jaipur to play bridge. And so he said he spent the war drinking gin and playing bridge mostly, which that was his story anyway. And because the thing was, if he'd been going a few months earlier, or a few weeks earlier, he would have fought. He would have been in Burma against the Japanese, and who knows what would have happened. He could have been killed, or he would have been in a prisoner of war camp. We all know what they were like from stories that came through that. By this time, my mother, who he had not yet met, was living in London with her mother in Stockwell in South London. This is a picture of my mother. That's right. That's her family. That's my grandfather in the middle there, and her 2 older brothers, which we knew about, and that's typical of the sort of photographs you had taken in a, properly taken. So anyway, she was living in South London, and with her mother, and also her 2 brothers were actually in the merchant navy, and they were out in the Atlantic avoiding torpedoes from U-boats, while my mother and her mother were living at home and trying to avoid bombs from the Luftwaffe in London. And her story was that they used to have an air raid shelter in the garden, and in the if there was a raid had started, they would go down into the air raid shelter, and one night they both had colds, and so they decided, rather than go to the air raid shelter and spend the night there, if the sirens went off, the thing that you did was to go and get under somewhere that would protect you against falling masonry. So you either went and got under the stairs, which is what they did. When the air raid siren went off, they went and sat under the stairs until it was over. Apparently, it was for falling. If it was a direct hit, you didn't stand a chance. But if it was hit and it was falling masonry, you had some protection like that. And if it went off all of a sudden, you could dive under a stout table. Apparently, was what my mother told me. But anyway, the air raid siren did go off, and they got out of bed and went down and sat under the stairs, and then the all clear went, and they heard all the sort of bangs and crashes and everything, with bombs going on around them. And as soon as the air raid, the siren, the all clear was sounded, there was a knocking at the front door, and my mother opened the door, and out there were the ARP wardens and the fire brigade and the bomb disposal unit, and said to my mother that you have an unexploded bomb in your garden. And so they let them all in and they trooped through. And my mother and grandmother made copious cups of tea for them. And while one of them was coming through, he said, "Why weren't you in the air raid shelter tonight?" And they said, we explained the reason why they weren't there, and they had colds. He said, well, the bomb, he said, it buried itself, it hit the soft earth of the garden, and buried itself 17 feet down, and and didn't detonate. And so he said that, but if you had been, and it went into the earth right next to the air raid shelter, and if you'd been in it, it would have killed anybody who was in it with the impact. And so that was my mother's story, that she had avoided death in that way, and slightly differently from my father. Well, in 1945, when the war came to an end, my father came back from India, and the first thing he did, or one of the first things he did, was to look up two of his mates, which were my mother's two brothers. And he knocked on the door in Stockwell in London, and my mother, when the war started, was 14 years old. Well, when the war ended, she was 20. And my father knocked on the door, and my mother answered, and he asked if Vic and Jack were in, because they would go out for a drink. And she said, "No, I'm afraid they're out." And he said, "Well, who are you?" And then she told him her name was Iris, and he said, "Well, perhaps you'd like to come out for a drink instead." So in 1946, they actually got married. In 1947, my sister was born, and in 1949, I was born. But going back to what had happened was that my mother, the two older brothers were at war, and my mother was there. But the brother that we didn't know about, called Ronald, was, because he was much younger, he was 4 years younger, he was evacuated. And he spent his time in North Devon with a family. We know very little about that. And when he came back to England, when he came back to London, rather, after his stay away, he was then 16, and he started out on a life of crime. And he started shoplifting and stealing cars, and he was in trouble with the law quite a few times. And eventually, he was caught for breaking and entering, and he received a prison sentence. And the time he was in prison, he went to Lewes prison for a period, apparently. And the thing about my mother getting married at that time, what was quite interesting about that, she actually changed her name automatically, because she lost her original surname and she became Iris Dowding. Before that, her surname was Biggs. And of course, Ronnie, while he was in prison in Lewes, he met up with a guy called Bruce Reynolds, who was to become the architect of the Great Train Robbery. So what at the time I've always spent thinking about this afterwards was how my mother had kept that an absolute secret. And of course, we don't know what happened to to people when they're evacuated. And it was the Great Train Robbery, of course, took place in 1963. I mean, this time I was 1963, I'm trying to work that out. I was 14 in 1963. And my mother, because when you think about it, somebody who is in trouble with the police, not only that, I mean, after the Great Train Robbery, I mean, he was obviously caught, and the haul of the Great Train Robbery was £2.5 million in used banknotes, which actually was the biggest robbery to date at that time. And that haul would be worth 50 million today. So it was a huge amount. And of course, that's why they received incredibly harsh prison sentences for that. And that's why, in the end, all they thought about was breaking out, which is what, of course, Ronnie Biggs did. That he broke out of prison and went on the run. Now, he was only a small player, really, in the Great Train Robbery. But when he escaped from prison, I mean, he was on the front page of the Daily Express virtually all through the 60s. They would always find out a story about him. Firstly, the Great Train Robbery, then the escape, and then, of course, being chased all around the world, as he did. And my mother, and I can only think that I don't even remember these things. I mean, when someone escapes from prison, what the police usually do is go and look at the immediate family. Well, I never remember anybody coming and investigating that. My mother never mentioned anything about it. And we must have said to her, look, you've got the same maiden name. We knew her maiden name. You've got the same maiden name as this guy who's in the news. And she must have said something, because I don't even remember. She must have said something like, well, it's just a coincidence. And we believed her. So it wasn't until my son actually came along and did this up now. There is Ronnie Biggs, and that's a mugshot of when he was arrested. And this is a screenshot of my phone. This is what Alex sent me, the picture like that, and that's the first thing I saw, and that made me laugh out loud. And this is what he said. And when I said to him, it was it that I said in green, that picture is the Great Train Robber. And of course, Alex, being the generation after us, didn't know when he saw it, and his single reply was, "Seriously?" And I felt the same. So anyway, every now and again, I keep going back to thinking, how did my mother do it? And of course, she'd now be she must have done it through shame. So she's obviously turning in her grave now that I'm standing out here telling all of you all about my infamous uncle. So anyway, that's the story. And thanks for listening, everyone. That's great. Very kind. Thank you. Thank you.